it going, folks? Hope you're there. Hello, Brianna. How are you today? Brianna, what was the last thing we talked about on Monday? Hi, Heather. Doing well, thank you. Been a busy week. What was the last thing we covered, Brianna, on Monday at 2 o'clock? Where did we end up? And seems like we got into chapter 12 a little bit. Good. The last time on the notes was the spinal cord. Okay. Did we finish all the notes on the brain? Do you remember that? Hello, Brooke. Hello, Jessica. Okay, Brianna, that's good. Hello, Anisha. Sessions. Good afternoon, Jasmine. Stephen, how's it going, Stephen? Hope it's well. I might not have. I'll have to check and see what your email was about. I've had quite a few of them. Hi, Dominique. Well, I tell you what, guys, they found out she has what they call temporal arteritis. You have an artery that comes off the carotid, and it goes up in front of the ear and feeds your scalp and so forth on both sides. And she actually went almost blind in one eye, in the right eye. Her jaw was aching. She could barely open her jaw. We had no idea what this was, but this ENT looked at her and he said, you know, your signs and your symptoms are really classic for what they call temporal arteritis. So that's what we found out Monday afternoon, because, you know, we didn't have a meeting, and I sent you that paper to look at, that Word document. And she's got to go in for surgery tomorrow morning. We got to be there before 6 o'clock. And she's going to have a couple of biopsies on those temporal arteries. So they've got to cut open a couple of places and take a little bit of tissue out of there. They call it giant cell arteritis. And the giant cell, I was curious about. I started looking that up. And next thing I know, it was a monocyte and a macrophage. Very large cells, and they, for some reason, are attacking the lining blood vessels in that area. It could go downhill very quickly, but they've got her on prednisone right now, and that is reducing the inflammation. We don't know why it comes on. We don't know how it comes on. But we're still in, can we say, the battle to some degree? Although the prednisone is working, it's not necessarily wiping out the situation. So tomorrow morning, 500, we're going to hit the road so we can be there at McLeod. And I appreciate those of you that know the Lord and you pray for her. I appreciate that very much. Okay, let's see. We're missing. Oh, Kenya, here you are. Okay, good. Okay, Nisha. Paul is not here. And Victoria. Let's see. Jessica Shelley. I see Sessions here. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Hey, Paul. Okay. Thank you very much there, Heather. I appreciate that a whole lot. Doctor needs expertise and wisdom and so forth. Now let's see. We have not looked at anything in chapter 12, have we? Is that correct? Because you haven't seen anything that we've talked about in terms of the Word document that I sent you, right? Thank you, Heather. Kenya, Steve, Paul, so just thank you very much. Okay, so I sent those out to you, so let's look at some things so that if you have some questions, you can ask and you can go along with that handout. I'm still making more and more of that handout and making it longer and longer. So I'll have to send you some new stuff. maybe later this afternoon. So let's look in chapter 12. I think we finished up with it. Did we finish up with the eye? Last thing we talked about was rods and cones. Did we do that? Got to get me a book stand over here. Trying to use a lamp, and it's not the most stable thing. So we talked about the rods and the cones, didn't we? Cones help you see color, rods help you see it in low light. And I think we mentioned probably something kind of unusual. We talked about rhodopsin, about retinol, and opsin, and iodopsin. Those were pigments that help us see. Does that ring a bell to you? Okay, Paul says he thinks we've covered that. So let's look on page 425 of chapter 12. 425 of chapter 12. See, you turn that light on, it just washes everything out, doesn't it? But it's not a recording studio or anything like that, so that's why it's like that. Okay, on page 425, you've got an overview. You think we cut off there at the rods and cones of Kenya? Is that what you're saying? Okay. So did we not talk about the rods? Look in chapter 15, see if that's see if we covered that last week. Look in page 555. All of you go there and see if we looked at that and made some notes there. Look on page 555. Okay, good. So we talked about rhodopsin on page 556. And we talked about those pigments down there, opsin and retinol, and then iodopsin and photopsin. We spoke about that. Helps us see color. Okay, good. So we're going to close that particular chapter at that point. We're going to chapter 12. And as we go through chapter 12, you've got some of a handout there that deals with this chapter. You can see the title of it is the Central Nervous System. Now, as you look in the second column, look at the second column on page 425, and you see up at the top it says the brain and spinal cord are anatomically a single continuous structure. I'll tell you that later, Nigel. Let's just go on with the lecture here. I want you to come down 6 lines on that second column. And you see there in that particular sentence, it says it has internal cavities and they're called ventricles. Now, probably when you think of ventricles, you think of cavities in the heart. But here's another place where we use that term ventricle. It's a cavity. And you see there it says that cavity, and there are actually 4 ventricles in the brain. They're not all the same size or anything like that, but they all contain a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. I'll give you updates on at the end of the lecture, okay? Let's go ahead and finish this. So as you come down to line 6 and you see ventricles, look right below ventricles, and you see the term cerebrospinal fluid. So it's not only in the brain, but it's in the spinal cord. So knowing that, keep that in mind, because we're eventually going to tie all of that together at the end, and you'll have this fluid that flows through your brain and around your brain to cushion your brain and protect it. So you look at the next paragraph, and it says the brain consists of 4 divisions. And you see it's the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So come on down in that same column. We're going to just look at those pieces for a minute, and then we're going to get a little bit deeper into them. So as you look at that bold print term that says cerebrum, that's the biggest part of our brain. That's the top portion. Some people would call it the cap or whatever. That's all right. Largest portion, and it's divided in half. So you have 2 hemispheres. Hemi means half. And of course, a sphere is a round structure, and the brain is somewhat of a round structure. So you've got a right and a left cerebral hemisphere. You see the bold print terms there. And notice it says each hemisphere has 5 lobes. We're going to get into what each of the lobes and some of the part of the lobes and what they do for us. But when you think of the cerebrum, you come on down to the next sentence and you see it says it's responsible for higher mental functions, like what you're doing today, like what I'm doing as I'm thinking about these various parts of the brain. Math is another higher level function as opposed to just looking at something and not having any kind of response to it. And so you see there it involves memory, it involves learning. Cognition is another word just for thinking. Your language, being able to speak the language coherently, clearly, so that people understand you. And even understanding the language is part of the brain's activity. Obviously, we have a hard time. If somebody comes in and starts talking in Taiwanese, then we're at a loss for what they're saying because we're not used to those syllables. And you see, it also says it plays a role in movement. So we have to respond to things in the environment. That's just a little synopsis, a little summary about the cerebrum. We'll spread it out a little bit more in a few minutes. You see the second part's called the diencephalon. Now, you see di, and that would typically mean two. And it does, but there are actually four parts, but we're only going to be concerned with two parts. And so you come down into the paragraph, and you see that it says it's the central core of the brain, and the diencephalon is made of four parts. We'll talk about them a little bit later. You got the hypothalamus and the thalamus and so forth. We'll get to that in a little bit, some of the functions they have. But it's got four parts in there, so di sort of tends to fool you. Notice the next to the last sentence, under diencephalon, in that little category, homeostatic functions. Now, when we started this course, we talked about the homeostasis of blood sugar. We talked about the homeostasis of the temperature of the body, and there are other homeostatic mechanisms that we did not touch. You think about one that we mentioned on the last test, you think about blood calcium. You have to have a certain level of blood calcium in your bloodstream, and we talked about calcitonin and parathormone and how those two hormones help keep it balanced in our bloodstream. That's just another one. There are hundreds of those things in our body that keep the internal environment constant. And of course, that's what we think of as being healthy. When everything is constant and it's like staying between the sides of the road. You stay on the middle there and you're okay. So there are a lot of homeostatic mechanisms that the thalamus, the diencephalon, we'll get to the other parts of it a little bit, takes charge of. Then you see the cerebellum. This might help you. Let's do this. Let's flip over to the next page. Look at 426. There's a nice picture, picture 12.1. And you see the cerebrum looks like some coiled material. You guys have taken the brain in the lab, and so you have some idea what it should look like. So you see the big cerebrum up there. You come down to see the diencephalon, that sort of purplish structure, purplish blue. And you see functions over to the right. And then you come back to page 425 and you look at the cerebellum. On page 425, we're back on that page for a second. And you see it says it's composed of a right and a left hemisphere. And you read the next sentence and it talks about the coordination of movement. Notice also it mentions playing an instrument. Some of you perhaps can do that. Some of you perhaps were athletes. And so that takes coordination. Again, we use that little lady, Simone Biles, and all the activity that she does and the movements. Her cerebellum plays a huge role in her carrying out those complex movements as she flies through the air so that she comes down on her feet. And then you see down, if you look back over here on page 426, you see the sort of pinkish structure, or salmon, somebody might say. You see it's under the back of the cerebrum. The cerebellum is under the back of the cerebrum. And you see it's involved in coordinating movement. It even lets you know when you're in the middle of movement, oh, I didn't do that exactly right. You're conscious of those things, and so you start making adjustments. And then you look back over on page 425 and you got the brainstem. Now they'll call that the oldest part of the brain. That's because they think you and I came from a lizard or a fish or something like that. The interesting thing is that they'll tell us that, but nobody's ever seen chemicals come together and produce a structure that is complex, a structure that is that has purpose, that has regulatory mechanisms in it, like homeostatic mechanisms that we have. Nobody's ever seen that happen, but they'll tell you that's happened. Kind of like your computer just showed up on your front porch one day. So same sort of thought pattern. But you got the brainstem. Don't worry about that being the oldest part. But what you want to notice is the brainstem connects the brain and the spinal cord. Now, there are several structures in there where that connection is made. Hello, Jessica. Let's see, where are you? Okay, thank you. So as you look over on page 426, and you see a picture of the brainstem up there at the top, sort of that purplish structure. Right under the diencephalon, comes down into sort of a bulge, and then there's a smaller bulge below, right where that brainstem line is pointing. That's part of the brainstem. Where it gets real narrow, after that, that's where they call it the spinal cord, because it comes through the foramen magnum. Now, you probably have seen that already in the skulls that you had to examine, and now you're looking at the contents of the skull, the brain, and so after the brainstem, it gets very narrow and goes down through the vertebral column. Okay? Any questions about just that general overview of the brain? Now, if you remember, back in chapter 11, we talked about neurons. We talked about neurons that had no insulation around the axon, and we said they were unmyelinated. Those that had myelin around the axon, those were called myelinated axons, myelinated neurons. Look at the frontal view of a real brain cut below. And you probably have seen this in your lab models. But notice what it's labeled with. Is cerebral gray matter. It points at, it's a little darker. It's kind of like a lighter than one of those little caramels that you can buy. Those little caramel candies. And of course, you know, some of those caramel candies have that little white inside. So that might be a good way to think about that. The outside, which is kind of light brown, that's what they call unmyelinated. That's gray matter. unmyelinated axons. And then you see over to the right where that line points to the white area, that's myelinated. So it has that insulation around it. Now look at the last sentence of that first column on page 426. It's right above that frontal section. And you see that last sentence says each lobe of the cerebrum contains bundles of white matter called tracts. And notice what they do. They receive input from and send output to the different clusters of cell bodies and dendrites in the cerebral gray matter. Those tracts are myelinated. The gray matter, those cell bodies, those are called nuclei. You may have had someone say, you got to use your gray matter. And what they're saying is you got to think about it. You got to figure things out. So if they say, you're not using your gray matter, then that just means they're telling you that you're not really thinking it through. So the brain has gray and the brain has white matter. Look to the right, not the middle picture, but the one over to the right says B, spinal cord, transverse section. And you see that section there, and you see gray matter that looks like maybe a moth or a butterfly. That doesn't have any myelin. And then you look at the spinal white matter, it's a little bit lighter colored brown there. And that's myelinated. Questions on that? So look on page 428. Page 428, and you look at these pictures of the exterior of the brain. Now, you've already seen that, I imagine, in the lab. So you know what a sulcus is. If you don't, let me know. I would call a sulcus a shallow groove, a ditch, a small ditch, or whatever. And then on either side, when you have a depression like that, you've got a raised area, which is called a gyrus. So you can see there are a lot of sulci, little depressions on the surface of the brain, and you have raised areas. Now, why is it like that? Well, if you read the right matter in here, as a matter of fact, look over on the previous page, or the opposite page, 429. Second column. As you look at that second column, starts out gray matter, cerebral cortex, come all the way down to the last two lines of the first paragraph. the last two lines of the first paragraph. And you see this sentence that says the many convolutions up and down like that of the gyri give the neocortex, or you could just put the cortex, a large surface area. If it was all smooth, you would reduce the area maybe 40%. Can you think of any part of your body that we have talked about? Any tissue where structures were found that increased the surface area of that tissue? Can anybody think of it? Kenya, it's on page 429, second column, last two sentences of the first paragraph. No, we don't have that there, Paul, but you're in the right area. Just got to get a little higher up. Anybody think about where that might be? You're in the right system. Well, you think about it. Some kind of question like that might come up on final exam because you've been exposed to all of that. So I'm just trying to get you to think, okay, we got this over here, we got that over here, and it does the same thing in a sense. No, I don't know about that. Remember, I told Paul he was in the right system. But anyway, just make a little note. So you want to know the names of these parts of the brain. You want to know where the frontal lobe is, the parietal, and it's pretty easy because you've already studied the skull. So underneath the parietal bone is the parietal lobe, and the occipital bone, and therefore the occipital part of the brain is there. So pretty easy to remember. You've got those bones on the skull that really mirror the parts of the brain. So look at the bottom picture. As you look at the bottom picture, you see that big groove? Now, you probably already know that, don't you? Called a longitudinal fissure. So you've got several fissures in the brain. You got a number of sulci, you got a number of gyri. If you look right down the middle of that top of the brain picture, superior view, and you got the longitudinal fissure right down the middle. That's why you got two cerebral hemispheres. And you also have, hang on just a minute, please. I'm teaching, y'all are coming right in here talking about stuff. Thank you. Just had a little competition, that's all. So you look at the top picture, this is on page 428. You're looking at a side view, a lateral view of the brain, and you see to the left of the upper picture of the brain, you see lateral fissure. Makes sense, doesn't it? And I want you to look over to the right, another side view, another lateral. Kind of a challenge today. Okay. So you looked at that right picture, the right upper picture on page 428. Look to the right and you see the occipital lobe, don't you? I know you do because you can see it. And right below the occipital lobe is the structure called the cerebellum. And that groove in there, which is a deep groove, just like the longitudinal fissure, but it goes across, and so they call it a transverse fissure. That separates the cerebellum from the occipital lobe, at least to some degree. So you probably are familiar with these structures. That's good. It should make it easy for you to make a better grade on that last test. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then look at the bottom picture on the right. And you see where they're pulling apart with some clamps. They pull them apart. Or retractors, I think you would call them. And then there's a part of your brain under there called the insula. Now, let's look on page 429 again. And you look in the first column, and you come down to lobes of the cerebrum. So we're going to talk a little bit about the lobes. So you see the frontal lobes. And what I want you to realize is the frontal lobe has as its boundary toward the back of the brain. You come into that section there under frontal lobes, and you see central sulcus. That's that groove that goes all the way across on both sides of the hemispheres, central sulcus. In front of that, they call it the frontal lobe. I think you probably have covered some of this stuff, so I'd love to see you guys do really well on this. Now, look at the last sentence under frontal lobes. And you see it says, the last 4 lines, the neurons of the frontal lobe are responsible for planning and executing movement and complex mental functions. So when you take that test next Wednesday, then you're going to be using your frontal lobe. And you'll also be using your cortex. And you see it talks about also behavior and personality. So if a person gets damaged up here, their personality changes. We don't understand all of that. So not quite sure about personality. We can understand control of a hand or something with certain part of the brain. You can wiggle your fingers, play the pianos or something like that. Personality, that's kind of a little hard to grasp. Do you inherit that? Is it learned as you follow your father and your mother and so forth, or other people? Doctors don't have it all together. Nobody does. But we know a few things so that we can help people. And we're always trying to explain things too. So come down to the parietal lobes. That's the lobe underneath the parietal bone. Come down to the last three lines, and you see that lobe is involved in processing and integrating sensory information. Sensory information. That would be your eyes. There would be some integration there, sort of figuring things out. Hearing, maybe becoming very acute at tasting things, smelling things, feeling things on your skin. Feel the warmth of the sun. It's been a beautiful day today. Got a breeze out there. You can feel the breeze. So processing and integrating sensory information in attention. And, you know, there are a number of people who are taking, I remember I had a student, I encouraged her to take that, I forget the name of that medication, but she did well after she did that. She took that medication. She had a problem with focusing her attention. Now, does that mean that the parietal lobe was failing? Maybe so. We don't have all the answers, but we know this particular drug, and I can't remember what it was that she took, helped her pay attention. And I watched her grades go from 68 to 88. It was really great. Real nice to see that. But, you know, none of us are born perfect. That's why I don't have any hair right up here. We, in our way of thinking, having hair on your head is perfect. Obviously, I'm not perfect. Temporal lobes. Look at the last three lines. This is the general functions that they play a role in. And we'll get into some specifics a little later, but perform functions related to hearing and language. Of course, hearing and language, you got to hear it and then you got to understand it, okay? And then memory and your emotions. You come to your occipital lobes and look at the last sentence. The neurons of the occipital lobe perform in interpreting what you see. So you got a part of your brain that helps you interpret what you hear and you remember it. And of course, the same thing happens, something similar happens with the information you pick up with your eyes. I was at a wedding up in Wilmington a number of years ago, and they're all taking pictures of us as part of the family and so forth. And I'm listening, and here's this guy talking out there in the church. And of course, it didn't make any difference that he was talking because we were taking a picture. We weren't trying to listen or anything. But as I heard his voice, I said, I know that voice somewhere. Turned out to be he was a Hollywood actor that I had seen in a number of movies. Well, same thing with your eyes. You remember people's facial features and, you know, is that so-and-so and so-and-so? It kind of looks like them, you know. So the same thing happens with your occipital lobe in terms of information, but it happens to be visual information. I had a guy in the Army with me who got a fungal infection in the occipital lobe of his brain. His eyes were fine, but that yeast, which is a type of fungus, had destroyed occipital neurons. And so he could no longer interpret what he was seeing. It was real sad. It's fortunate that he didn't die. That fungus usually takes people out. But that's what can happen sometimes. And we don't even know how we pick that stuff up sometimes. Okay, so there are the four lobes, the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, the occipital, and you got the insulas. And you see that's the one that's sort of hidden by the temporal lobe and a little bit of the frontal lobe. And if you look at the last sentence, they don't know. Don't ever think science has got it together. Okay, we're just not real sure of what it does. Okay, now let's go to page 430. And you got this nice brain up there that's been colored with red and blue and sort of an orange or whatever. And so we want to know some things about that. Look at your central sulcus. The central sulcus is that groove between the red marked area called primary motor cortex and the blue, which is called primary somatosensory cortex. So the little groove between the red and the blue is what we call the central sulcus. Goes from one side over to the other. So if it says primary motor, that means it's dealing with movement, doesn't it? And primary somatosensory, somato meaning body, tells you about the, can we say the environment in a sense? You're picking up information like the wind's blowing, the sun is out, or it's hailing. You don't want to go outside and get hit by the hail. So there's your primary somatosensory cortex and your primary motor cortex. Now, we're not going to get into a whole lot of detail there, but you get the idea. So if those areas get damaged, then you can lose sensation, or depending on if it's on the anterior side of the central sulcus, then you can lose coordination, where you can't move like you normally would move. Now, we've already mentioned that the occipital lobe plays a role in our vision. I want you to come around, look at the back over there where the occipital region is. It says primary visual cortex. And move a little bit down and to the left, and you see Wernicke's. Well, let's look at visual association area. It's still visual, but it deals with you putting a number of pieces of information together so that you can identify objects that are similar, very similar, but you can separate them on the basis of some little detail that you pick up with your eyes. So those association areas process information, integrate information, connect pieces, put them together, so that you have a memory of maybe like the highway that goes to Charlotte, North Carolina, Highway 52 or something, and you remember various forms along the way. And so when you pass a certain thing, you say, okay, I know that. We're on the right road. I see that. And I remember that from 5 years ago. So that's what those association areas do. We have a lot of association areas. Wernicke's area. That is an area that helps you understand a language, such as English or Spanish or whatever. Helps you understand language. Auditory Association. You hear things and you judge what you are hearing by what you have heard in the last 18 or 20 years. You're thinking in those areas. You're putting information together. so that you can identify a particular sound. Like I identified that, I could see that guy's face in my mind when I heard that voice at that wedding. Move on a little bit more. Here's a primary auditory cortex. That's where you pick up sounds. And some of those sounds, some of those impulses, those nerve impulses, will go into the Auditory Association area so that you put together a picture, so to speak. Acoustically, you do that. And then you come over to the left and you see Broca's area. Broca's area deals with speech. So Wernicke's area helps you understand the language, but Broca's area helps you produce language. It helps you put the right emphasis on the syllable. So we have some pattern of saying the word all the time a particular way so that all of us in a community say it that way and we know what somebody is saying. So you want to know those, that would be physiology of those areas. Now, we said that we had two hemispheres, didn't we? A right hemisphere, left hemisphere. Look on page 432. So as you look in the first column, and we're not going to go up there at the top of the caudate nucleus, there's a whole lot of stuff. We just don't have time to cover all of that. So as you look in the second column, come down to where you see cerebral white matter. And you see under cerebral white matter, three types of white matter. Commissural fibers connect the right and left cerebral hemispheres. So even though we have this big split up here, come down to the picture, part A, where you see a frontal section of an illustration of the brain, and you see these purple lines that go from the left to the right and right to the left. And you see a little, looks like a little bubble stick where you put soap in there and blow in it. Got a straight line, a little hole on the end. You see, those are commissural fibers of the corpus callosum. That's what connects our right side with the left side. I don't know about you, but it's fascinating to me to think about one cell turning into folks like you and me with a brain, and they're connected. The two hemispheres are connected. There is communication between the right and the left, just like we have communication in athletic events where the right hand does a certain thing and the left hand does another. They work as partners. And then you see projection fibers. And you see it says You see the connection is between the cortex of one area and the cortex of another. So even the areas on one side, they're connected with each other, again, so that we have a fuller capacity to put together information and respond to it in an appropriate manner. So those projection fibers, they stay in one hemisphere, but they hook different gyri to each other. That's another way of saying that. And you see also association fibers do the same thing, but evidently they're different to some degree. So just know that they connect the gray matter of the gyri. Got a lot of connections. Did you guys ever, with your parents maybe, or you were at a particular age, or maybe you're married and you now have a family, how many of you have ever seen a house go up? You know, pour the foundation, put in a wall, a retaining wall or whatever, and then you start putting the wood on top of that, the joists and so forth, and then you get your framing, and the next thing you know, when you get your framing in, here come the electricians, and they're running wires all over the place. Well, we got wires, in a sense, all over the place within our brain. So we have all these connections so that we have a fuller perception of what we're looking at. We can offer a fuller perception of what we think we see. It's just amazing. Do you have any questions on the cerebrum? On the various lobes? They are separate areas that contribute to the whole of the possibility of the brain activity. Okay, if you have no questions at this point, let's go to page 434. Don't forget, I'm going to talk to you about when the test will be and so forth and what will be on it. Of course, we're looking at a lot of it, aren't we? So look on 434 and you see that term diencephalon. And you see the description there. It's found at the center of the brain. And there are two, actually you can see, let's see if we can see four over here. I see, hypothalamus, thalamus. As you look at the top picture to the right in the second column, you see the thalamus. We want to look at that just a minute. We're concerned with that. You see this little nipple that sticks up, that little hill there between them, that's the epithalamus. We're not going to talk about that. And then you come over down on the left, you see the hypothalamus. That would be under the thalamus. Did you have to learn that in lab? Where the thalamus was? And then you have the subthalamus. We're not going to talk about the subthalamus. So we're going to talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And I would imagine whoever you have, Mr. Davis, Mr. Boggs, showed you on those models where they would delineate the thalamus and where they would delineate the hypothalamus. But coming down the left-hand side of the page, you see the thalamus. Now come to the third line. You look in the middle, and you see it says, between these two masses lies a cavity known as the third ventricle. Now, we haven't even talked about the first and the second yet, but just keep that in mind. There is a ventricle there. It's not very wide, but it has some depth to it. It runs this way, front to back, but it's very narrow in there. It's not real wide, but that's where a third ventricle is, and we'll get to that eventually. And so you see it says right underneath there, the thalamic nuclei, or you can simply just say the thalamus, receives input from multiple sources, including the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, and so forth. Now come down where it says, where you see thalamic nuclei, and you can just put thalamus. I want you to come down one, count one from underneath thalamic, 2 limbic, 3 smell, and then you see the thalamus is literally the main entrance into the cerebral cortex. All the sensations that we have, the wind blowing on our skin and so forth, it's getting hot in here, cold in here, whatever, all those receptors are picking up the environmental stimuli and they take it to the thalamus. And the thalamus is like a station where it sends it to the right places so that a homeostatic mechanism can take place to some degree, or you do something like turn down the heat or whatever. So you see it says the thalamus is literally the main entrance into the cerebral cortex. Nearly all information destined for the cerebral cortex must first pass through the thalamus. So that's a station where information comes in and gets shipped to the right place. Maybe like a post office. I don't know. Is that a bad example? A post office? All that mail comes in, they sort it out, and you got all these little mail trucks going around putting mail in your mailbox. Now, that's all we're going to say about the function of the thalamus. But if you don't have that, you're dead in the water. That's all there's to it. Come down to the bottom where you see the hypothalamus. You see it's a collection of nuclei too. Sits anterior and inferior. So it's in front of the thalamus and below it. Skip the next sentence and look at the third sentence. It says, don't let its small size fool you. Though as the hypothalamic nuclei perform a number of functions just so that we survive. A number, those would be homeostatic mechanisms. And you see there it says some of these include regulating the autonomic nervous system. Now, I hope to get into that. That's where you have your parasympathetic, your sympathetic, your digest and rest, your fight or flight responses, and so forth. The sleep-wake cycle, thirst. Just think if you didn't have the thalamus to tell you that, the hypothalamus to tell you need to get some water, you'd just dry up and die because all your blood vessel would run out of water, and then you just have nothing but cells in there and they'd clog right up. Obviously, you don't have too much. All of that gets regulated, and all you got to do is study anatomy and pass the test. Or maybe when you get through here, you go to a job, something like that. Over on page 435, it says, in addition, up at the top, the hypothalamus has a close anatomical and functional connection to the pituitary gland. We're not going to talk about the pituitary gland so much in this segment of anatomy. That comes into 211. But you've got the, let's see, it says the pituitary gland is attached to the inferior portion of the hypothalamus, a little stalk called an infundibulum. Now, I want you to read the rest of that paragraph. Starts off with the hypothalamus secretes a variety of hormones. We're not going to get into all of those, but there are two in there that I want you to know about, and I think you probably heard about them back in 210 and back in 110. You come down, you see an italics rather. It says antidiuretic hormone, and you see oxytocin. I think you probably heard about that. Antidiuretic, if you take a diuretic, then that's going to make you produce a lot of water, and you're going to have to go to the bathroom quite a bit. An antidiuretic stops that production of water, or at least slows it down. And then oxytocin is involved in making the uterus contract to get a little kid in there that needs to come out during birth. Okay? We didn't get through as far as I would like to, but our time is out, and I said I would answer some of those questions that you had. So, let's see. Anesthesia. What chapters will the exam be on? 12, 13, 14, and 15. Okay, so you think about the eye that we covered, this we covered, and we'll have to cover the rest of it on Monday afternoon. But I'm going to send you a paper to read so that you will know what you got to pull out of this book, and we'll go over that. And I think probably next Wednesday we will have the 5th lecture test. So let's count on next Wednesday as having a 5th test. And then the following week, probably that Monday, we'll have a final exam. 125 questions. Now, Brooke, I think that answers your question. Does that, you and Anesthesia satisfied with that answer? Appreciate you waiting. Are you all asleep? Or are you cut off? Or you're not there anymore? Is anybody still breathing on that side of the screen? Well, I hope you guys don't have the coronavirus and you're about to kick out. I'm going to close it out if you don't have anything to say. All right. Maybe we got bad connections. Oh, there's a few that are still breathing out there. Okay, good. All right. Well, you guys have a nice weekend, and I'll probably ship out a little bit, another Word document that it's going to extend. So read it, because we're only going to have one more lecture, I think. I'm glad you're out there breathing, guys. All right, I'm going to close it out. Okay, see you later.